Good evening, everyone, depending on if you're located in WA or could be afternoon. My name's Megan Henderson and I'm from NEA BPD Australia. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, NEA BPD acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. For those of you who may not be familiar with our organisation, NEABPD, we primarily aim to support families and carers of people living with a personality disorder, which can affect up to 17% of the population. There are many types of personality disorders, but borderline personality disorder is one of the most commonly diagnosed. It is complex and it can wreak havoc not only for those living with it, but also for the people around them as well. NEA is a volunteer run organisation supported by over 200 volunteers right across Australia. We are one of 26 countries around the world that offers the Family Connections program. Family Connections is a 12-week evidence-based program that provides skills and hope to family members and carers. The program is offered free of charge to participants and is led by our volunteer leaders who generously give their time to support other families. We don't receive any government funding and rely solely on the generosity of our families and supporters. So thank you for everyone for coming tonight and those of you who have donated some money to be here. Just a bit of housekeeping. Please keep keep yourself on mute. We do have some pre-submitted questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. And then at the end, I will ask the questions of our speaker. I think that's all. So yes, I mentioned that we're recording. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening, Rachel Martin. Rachel's a clinical psychology PhD candidate and provisional psychologist at Monash University. Her research focuses on the overlap between neurodevelopmental conditions and personality disorder, with an emphasis on dimensional models of personality disorder. Rachel also has lived experience of borderline personality disorder and is passionate about making research and clinical changes meaningful for the community. The presentation tonight, Beyond the B in BPD, Understanding the Dimensional Model of Personality Disorder. I'll now hand over to Rachel. We're very grateful to have you here tonight, and thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'll just share my screen, get my presentation. Is everyone able to see my screen at the moment? Okay, perfect. So as mentioned just before in the introduction, my name's Rachel and I'm a clinical psychology PhD candidate at Monash University. I would also just like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge their deep connection to the land and waterways over the past tens of thousands of years, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander folks who may be joining today. So my presentation is called Beyond the B in BPD, and it's all about understanding the dimensional model of personality disorder. And it really comes from this kind of shift that I've noticed in the way that we're talking about personality disorder in the research and clinical space. But oftentimes it feels like people with lived experience are being left out of that conversation, and there really isn't enough community awareness about the changes that are happening in the field. I've had personal experience with this. When I started my PhD, I knew very little about the dimensional model, even though I have lived experience with BPD. So hopefully after today, you'll understand a little bit more about what the dimensional model is and why we're trying to move more towards it, and what that means for you. So what we're going to cover today is firstly talking a little bit about why diagnosis matters, and then I'll chat a bit about how personality disorder is currently diagnosed using what we call the categorical system. I'll then talk about the problems with this system, which prompted the DSM-5 to introduce a dimensional model, and also introduce the ICD-11 dimensional model. They're both quite similar. I'll then discuss why this shift matters, what it means, and how you can support your loved ones through this framework. I think this has all been mentioned, but I am a PhD candidate and provisional psychologist. So I'm training to be both an academic and a clinician in the space. And my research focuses on dimensional models and how we can use it to understand the intersection of personality disorder with other conditions. So in my case, I'm specifically looking at ADHD and autism. But I also have lived experience with BPD, and I identify with BPD diagnosis. So I'll be drawing from both perspectives today. But if anything I say is a little bit too researcher jargony, please just let me know at the end, and I'm really happy to clarify anything. So, why does diagnosis matter? Why do we care so much about the terminology that we're using to describe what someone is going through? So, the diagnosis that someone receives has a whole host of implications for both themselves and the broader system that they're navigating. So, one of the most important implications of a diagnosis is access to services. So, by receiving a diagnosis, someone is often able to access specialized services, or a clinician may be able to implement a specific treatment type. So, if we take the example of BPD, receiving a BPD label can often help clinicians decide, okay, this person might benefit from DBT or maybe mentalization approaches, or it might allow them to be referred to a special service that really helps people going through a similar thing. On a more personal level, diagnosis can be really important for validation. And this is something that I experienced myself after, going through so many challenges and feeling really quite isolated. It can be a really lovely experience to learn that there is a label that describes what you're going through and that there's a whole community of people out there who are experiencing similar things to you or have experienced similar things and made it out the other side. So a diagnostic label like BPD can help people understand what's going on for themselves and also find communities like NEA BPD. Another really important implication is clinical communication. So when two psychologists are talking to each other, maybe one of them is referring a client on. The psychologist might say, this client has depression. And then that other psychologist is meant to be able to get a good idea of what's going on for that person and maybe the approach that they'll take to building a good relationship with that client. Same thing goes with BPD. If one psychologist says to another, my client that I'm referring to you has a diagnosis of BPD, the idea is that other psychologists would then get a good understanding of who's about to walk through their door. Diagnosis also has implications for stigma. So we all know that mental health conditions can be incredibly stigmatized and that there's certain labels that are more stigmatized than others. And BPD is a very stigmatized diagnosis. The language that we use to describe these diagnostic labels actually has the power to reduce or increase stigma. So if we use language that is maybe not accepted by the community and maybe, reduces what someone's going through and kind of minimizes it, that can increase the stigma that they face in the mental health condition. In the mental health world, sorry. Whereas if we use language that's a little bit more accepted by the community and is validating for someone, this can help reduce some of that stigma. And finally, research. I think it's really easy to think of diagnostic categories as only really relevant for clinical use, but these categories often drive what gets studied and who gets included in studies, as well as what gets funded. So now I've spoken a bit about diagnosis. Hopefully it's clear to you that it's really important that we get someone's diagnosis right and that it's an accurate depiction of what they're going through. And it's also really important that if two different psychologists see the same person, that they would land on the same diagnosis. We don't want people's diagnosis to change based on who they're seeing. So to try and improve this reliability between clinicians, we've introduced what's called diagnostic systems. And there's two main diagnostic systems that we use in psychology, and these are called the DSM-5 and the ICD-11. And they're essentially these huge books that are filled with different symptoms and different conditions and diagnostic labels and provide a bit of a guide for clinicians on when someone might meet criteria for a diagnosis or when a diagnostic label of something like BPD might be helpful for that person. The DSM-5 is the main system that's used in Australia, whereas the ICD-11, although it was intended for international use and developed by the World Health Organization, is mainly used in a European context. Whereas the DSM-5, it's American, but we use it in Australia. Previously, these two manuals have taken what we call a categorical approach to personality disorder diagnosis. And this is where we have 10 distinct personality disorders that are unique from each other. So each of the 10 types is meant to be quite unique, and there's not meant to be much overlap between them. The DSM-5 still uses this categorical approach in its main part of the manual, whereas the ICD-11 is moving towards more of a dimensional model. I'm going to break down now how the DSM-5 diagnoses personality disorder using this categorical approach. So if you open up the DSM-5 to the personality disorder section, you'll see that there, as I mentioned, there are 10 specific types of personality disorder, and these are broken down into 3 clusters. Now, I will just mention that I really hate the language that we use to describe each of these clusters, and I think it really goes back to my point before about diagnostic labels increasing the stigma that someone faces. But I thought it was still important to include here, just so you know the kind of language that's included in this manual. So we've got cluster A, which describes odd or eccentric personality disorder. And these are things like paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorder. Then you've got cluster B, which describes dramatic or emotional, and this has antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorder. And then cluster C, which is anxious or fearful, and that describes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So these are thematic clusters. So the idea is that things in cluster B are generally similar to each other, and things in cluster A generally similar to each other, and so on. But the main idea is that someone with paranoid personality disorder is quite distinct from someone with borderline personality disorder. The idea is that these are very separate categories. Now, the focus of this talk is on BPD, so I'm just going to run through a little bit more detail on how BPD looks like in the current system. But I wanted to flag that it's pretty much the same for every one of those categorical personality disorder diagnoses. There just might be different symptoms listed, a different number of symptoms, and a different number of symptoms that you might have to display to meet a diagnostic threshold. So when we're talking about borderline personality disorder, if you open up the manual, you'll see that there's 9 symptoms listed here. And these symptoms might be things that you're familiar with. So things like frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, identity disturbance, chronic emptiness, and so on. What a clinician will do is they will assess whether the person in front of them is displaying these symptoms. So it's very much a yes-no approach. So they'll go through and they'll say, okay, is this person experiencing identity disturbance? Yes or no? Is this person experiencing chronic emptiness? Yes or no? If they tick yes for at least 5 of those symptoms, then that person in front of them is eligible for a BPD diagnosis, so long as it's the best description of what's going on for them. I just wanted to flag that this system is quite black and white. So it's either you're displaying the symptom or you're not displaying the symptom. And you either have a BPD diagnosis or you don't have a BPD diagnosis. There's no sort of shades of gray and there's no kind of severity index here. It's just diagnosis or not diagnosis. So this seems like a really great system. It seems like a quick way to make a diagnosis, a quick way to standardize things across clinicians. And it has served us well, and it's helped us build a lot of awareness around personality disorders. But more and more research has come out, which has started to question the reliability and the validity of this diagnostic system, and really questioning how useful it is for clinicians and for the community. So I'm just going to run through a couple of the problems with the categorical model now. So the first problem is diagnostic overlap. As I mentioned, those 10 personality disorders are meant to be quite distinct from each other. And the idea is that someone with paranoid, for example, is very different to someone with BPD. But when we do studies of this, we actually find that most people who meet criteria for one personality disorder actually meet criteria for 2 other personality disorders as well. So most people who are being captured by this system are meeting criteria for at least three personality disorders. That can be quite confusing both for the clinician who's trying to decide which label fits them best, and also for the individual. If they are receiving 3+ personality disorders, it can be quite confusing to think, well, which one's actually describing me? What treatment should I be engaging in? What does this mean? On the flip side, there's also this common diagnosis of personality disorder not otherwise specified, or PDNOS. And this is where a clinician determines that someone in front of them, their client, meets the general criteria for a personality disorder. So what they're experiencing is consistent with personality disorder. That person isn't fitting into any of the specific types. So maybe they're only displaying 4 out of the 5 symptoms that they need to display for BPD. Or maybe they're displaying, also 3 symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder and then, another 3 symptoms of paranoid personality disorder. They're just not meeting that threshold. And so they get this label of PDNOS. And again, can be confusing for the clinician because it doesn't really tell you much. If we go back to clinical communication and access to services, PDNOS doesn't really tell you about where that person should go or what approach we should take or who's about to walk through your door. And it's also confusing for the person receiving this label because it's not very descriptive, and it can kind of just feel like you've been thrown in the wastebasket. Related to this, although these manuals were developed with, and one of the purposes of this development of the manuals was to improve reliability, a lot of clinicians actually struggle to agree on the presence or absence of a diagnosis using the categorical personality disorder system. So maybe one clinician thinks that someone has BPD, one person thinks no, they don't have BPD, they have another personality disorder, or maybe they don't have a personality disorder at all. So there's very little agreement between clinicians, and that's because we're taking very much a yes-no approach, and people often aren't presenting really in such black and white presentations like the book describes. There's often a lot more shades of grey, which can complicate reliability among clinicians. And then another problem is the arbitrary threshold. So the present-absent approach, as I mentioned, lacks the ability to determine severity. So what this means is because you only need to meet 5 out of 9 of the BPD criteria, and it can be any 5 of 9 of those symptoms, you actually have 256 different ways in which you can meet the criteria for BPD. So going back to what I said at the start, if a clinician says to another clinician, oh, I'm referring this client onto you, they have BPD, that clinician doesn't know which of the 256 different ways of BPD is going to walk through their door. So it's not very useful in terms of clinical communication. Related to this, one symptom change can completely change someone's diagnosis from present to absent. So someone who is displaying 4 symptoms can be determined as, oh, they're not going to benefit from treatment. They don't have BPD. They might not be able to access those specialized services. But if they just display one extra symptom, so maybe they just display impulsivity in at least 2 areas, which is one of the symptoms, then all of a sudden they're going to benefit from treatment. But we know when we're thinking about it that someone who's displaying 4 symptoms of BPD likely is having significant challenges in their life and might benefit from some of the therapeutic techniques that we use in DBT or NBT. And finally, these diagnoses are unstable over time. So significant diagnostic change within this model can occur over as little as 6 months. So if the same clinician assesses the same person, they assess them at the start of the year, then they assess them halfway through the year, they could completely change their mind on whether that person still has a personality disorder, or they could decide actually they have a different type of personality disorder. So obviously we have a lot of problems with this categorical model, and we need a new way of thinking about personality disorder. What this means for consumers is that you might receive 2 or 3 different labels, BPD plus histrionic personality disorder plus obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which can be a very confusing experience. Related to that, your diagnosis might shift between personality disorders. And when you have issues with your identity, having this shift can be really challenging. There's also no indication of severity or the specific presentation or combination of symptoms, which can make it hard for someone to have that validation from receiving a label like BPD because they don't know, well, which of the symptoms was I presenting with? Which of the symptoms contributed to this diagnosis? How much is this label actually capturing what I'm going through? There's also no real expectation of recovery built into this system, which I really take issue with. I think the approach has always been very much, you have BPD, this is what you have, and you're just going to have to figure out how to deal with it, which can feel quite defeatist. And I think because we don't have that sort of severity spectrum, it can be really hard for people to think, okay, I've just got to get rid of all of these symptoms and then I'll be fine. It can feel very overwhelming. And also, you can be labeled as cluster A, B, or C despite the lack of validity of this system. So the DSM itself says the clusters don't really have much support in the literature, but it continues to include them. And that can have a lot of implications for, stigma and how someone's labeled. Someone could get written off as, oh, they're just dramatic, they're cluster B, which is not a very nice experience. So, in light of all these problems, in 2013, the DSM-5 recognized these issues, and they included an alternative model for personality disorders, which I might refer to as the AMPD in this talk. So this acknowledges the problem with the categorical approach, and it proposes a dimensional alternative. But it's in what we call Section 3. So in the DSM-5, which is this huge book, we've got Section 2, which is where you can find all of the main diagnostic criteria, not just for personality disorder, but also for things like depression and anxiety and so on. And this is the main section that clinicians are using when they're trying to figure out what a client might be struggling with. Section 3, however, is more like an appendix, and it's where they put diagnostic categories that maybe they've decided need a bit more research or a bit more work to figure out how we're going to implement them. So because it's kind of tucked away at the back, most clinicians don't use it, and it's not widely taught to people like me who are completing their studies. But we are moving towards a system like this in research and practice, and there's a lot of push for this system to be put into that main section, section 2, in future editions of the DSM. So it's really important that the community is aware of what I mean when I say alternative model for personality disorders, because it could become the main way that we diagnose people in the coming years when the future DSM is released. So I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining this now. I'm going to explain dimensional models in general. So this relates to both the DSM-5 and then the ICD-11, which is that manual I mentioned at the start that's mainly used in Europe, that's fully moved over to this dimensional approach. So in the DSM-5 alternative model, or the ICD, when you look at the personality disorder section, instead of seeing those 10 specific types of personality disorder, you just see one personality disorder diagnosis. So it's just personality disorder, and I'm going to explain trait specified is what we specifically call it in the DSM-5. So you see personality disorder there, and then once we've decided, yes, this person has a personality disorder, we then describe it with two separate components. So we've got severity, which is the quantity of impairment and distress someone is facing. And then we've got style, which is the way in which that distress is manifested. So how is someone expressing that distress? How is someone expressing that impairment? What is the quality of the impairment? These things can be quite hard to conceptualize in such an abstract way. So I've stolen an analogy from my supervisor, Martin Selbom, which I think really nicely explains all of this. So if you have a look at these houses, I would say they're all pretty high in the severity range for niceness. Like I would love to live in all of these houses. And, you know, they're all beautiful, they're really fancy, they're gorgeous, they're all mansions, very high in severity. And if we think back to personality disorder, this would be very high in sort of dysfunction and distress. But if we take a closer look, they're actually all quite different styles. So this one's more of a classical mansion, this one's more of a Spanish style, and this one's a bit more modern. So even though they're all the same severity, the way in which that severity is expressed is completely different. So the style is different between the houses. Another example is musicians. So I would argue all of these musicians are just as famous and just as talented as each other, although maybe that's a bit debatable. And they're all very much on the high end of the severity spectrum here, okay? So thinking back to personality disorder, high dysfunction, high distress. But Dolly Parton's music is very different to Charlie XCX's music. So the style of these musicians is completely different. But that doesn't mean that they're not just as talented and just as famous as each other, okay? So that's how we kind of think about personality disorder. So we've got the overall diagnosis. We firstly specify severity, so how much impairment, how much distress. And then we describe the traits. So what is the style? What is the flavor of the difficulty? So bringing us back to serious talk now. So the DSM-5 alternative model has two components. So the severity component here is called the level of personality functioning. And then the style component are the personality traits. The level of personality functioning, which is also called criterion A, it considers someone's sense of identity, intimacy, ability to engage in empathy, and their self-direction. If someone is experiencing moderate impairment in these four areas, then they meet the threshold for a personality disorder in this model. So the impairment can range from no impairment all the way up to extreme impairment, with moderate being that threshold, rather than that 5 out of 9 symptom stuff that we have in the. We then describe what is the flavor of difficulty this person's experiencing. So they have moderate impairment, but how is that being expressed? What is the style? So we have 5 personality traits in this model. We've got negative affectivity, and that describes someone's experience of negative emotions and very intense experience of these. We've got detachment, which describes social withdrawal and emotional withdrawal. Antagonism or dissociality, which maybe is related to that traditional antisocial behavior construct, so maybe related to empathy. Then we've got disinhibition, which is impulsivity, and psychoticism, which is related to kind of the psychosis spectrum and the schizophrenia spectrum. It might include beliefs that are widely different from social and cultural norms. So when we're describing someone's style of personality disorder through the personality traits, we can use multiple traits. And BPD is often represented by negative affectivity, so the experience of negative emotions, disinhibition, so the impulsivity, and then sometimes antagonism. I do want to flag that in the DSM-5, there's the hybrid categorical model available for the alternative model of personality disorders. Essentially, what this is that the DSM-5 recognise that expecting clinicians to make the jump from those 10 specific personality disorders to a system like this, which is focused on specifying severity and traits, might be quite big and it might be quite confronting for clinicians. So what they did is they've included 6 of the 10 personality disorders. So it's got 6 categories, including BPD in there. But instead of describing BPD with those 9 symptoms, it describes BPD using the severity and the trait ratings. So it's like if someone you would have traditionally thought that they had BPD, here's a way that you can describe them using this model. So it's kind of there to just assist clinicians with the transition and assist us as we move towards more of a dimensional model. So that's the DSM-5 alternative model, and that's the one that's kind of tucked away in the back there. But we're moving towards it in, hopefully, the next version of the DSM. That's what the push is for. I'm now going to talk briefly about the ICD-11 model because I think it's really important context to understand, and it's also where my research is focused on. So in 2019, so a few years after the DSM, the ICD-11 launched their own dimensional personality disorder model. This is the main model in this diagnostic manual. So if you go to the ICD-11, you will not see the 10 personality disorder types that are still in the DSM-5. You won't see them. Instead, you will see one single personality disorder diagnosis, which again is specified by severity and traits. And overall, this is quite similar to the AMPD, or the alternative model for personality disorders. The main differences are that there is no hybrid categorical model like the AMPD. So they haven't kept those 6 personality disorder types in there, although there is something called a borderline pattern specifier, which I'm going to touch on a little bit later. And it does include slightly different traits, and there's a sub-threshold option. So I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. So we've got, if we go back, we remember that there's severity and style. Here, severity is obviously severity, and then style is personality traits. So very, very similar to the alternative model. Severity ranges from no impairment to severe. There's also unspecified, but I'm not sure how much that one is used. And what happens is a clinician decides this person has personality disorder, and then they determine the degree and pervasiveness of their challenges in understanding their identity. So things like goals and self-direction, and then their degree and pervasiveness of challenges relating to other people and engaging socially. It also considers the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral symptoms someone is showing and the kind of severity of these symptoms. The difference with this one here is this label of personality difficulty that's not in the alternative model. So the personality difficulty label can be used in 2 ways. The first way is to describe someone who might not be crossing the threshold into personality disorder, but is still experiencing difficulties related to their personality. So this is usually, and this is how it's kind of described in the ICD-11, maybe when someone is experiencing, disinhibition, so they're experiencing impulsivity, maybe they're struggling to connect with other people, but this is only occurring in one specific context. So it's only occurring at work. So it just doesn't reach that degree and pervasiveness that's needed for a personality disorder diagnosis. And they may not benefit from the full intensity of treatment that we use for personality disorder, but maybe a couple of techniques from DBT could be useful for them. The other way that personality difficulty is used, which I really like, is to describe someone who maybe previously met the threshold and was experiencing severe, moderate, or mild personality disorder, but they've engaged in treatment, and now their symptoms, they're still there. There's still a couple of challenges they're experiencing in certain conditions, or maybe when they're under distress, but it's not to the level of impairment that it once was. So they're still able to kind of largely function in their life. They're largely not experiencing distress, but there might be certain circumstances or certain contexts where they find it challenging still. So I think it's really good because I think it allows for this recognition of, you don't have to go from having this to not having this. There are kind of a couple of steps that we can take to manage this and manage the severity and go down sequentially. Then we've got the personality traits, which hopefully look a bit familiar to you. They're very similar to the DSM-5 model. So we've got negative affectivity, that's the negative emotions. Detachment, that's the social and emotional withdrawal. Dissociality, which is essentially the same thing as antagonism. They've just used a different name. So the antisocial behavior construct. disinhibition, so impulsivity. And then here, instead of psychoticism, we have anancastia. So the reason why we don't have psychoticism here is just because the ICD has always thought of the psychoticism personality disorder traits as in a separate section of the diagnostic manual. So that's more related to schizophrenia and psychosis in the ICD. So it's not relevant to how we talk about it here, just because it's never been conceptualized in that way. So instead of psychoticism, they have anancastia, which describes rigid perfectionism. So maybe this is setting really high standards for oneself or having a specific way that something needs to be done. And it's traditionally associated with the obsessive compulsive personality disorder type. So again, considers what is the flavor of difficulty that this person is experiencing, can be multiple traits. BPD is similarly represented by negative affectivity, disinhibition, and dissociality, or borderline pattern. So borderline pattern is a little bit controversial. Essentially, when the ICD unveiled their new system for personality disorder, a lot of people were really concerned that they were just making this jump to one single personality disorder diagnosis and that there was no sort of hybrid model. So this concern came both from clinicians and also from people with lived experience because they'd been left out of the conversation. And I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about how people with a personality disorder have been previously treated in the medical system. There's not much trust there, and rightfully so. So a lot of people were really upset with this decision, and they said we need a bit more of a transitionary period. So what the ICD-11 said was, okay, we'll introduce a borderline pattern, and that just recognizes that there's certain specific treatments that have been developed for BPD, there's specific organizations that have been developed around BPD, and this will help people still feel that validation from that label. So a clinician can specify a borderline pattern when someone meets 5 out of those 9 symptoms that I described earlier, but this is completely optional. And I did want to flag that BPD can be completely captured in this dimensional model. So all of the symptoms relating to BPD can be captured in this dimensional model without the borderline pattern specifier. But it's just there for clinicians who prefer to use it or individuals who feel that it might be helpful to describe what's going on for them. So that was a bit of a whirlwind tour. So I'm really happy to answer questions at the end about this. But some benefits of this model. One of the biggest benefits, I think, is it provides a bit more of a personalized diagnostic label. So instead of having those 256 different combinations and trying to figure out which of the 256 you might be experiencing, the trait combinations allow us to get a better picture of what is going on for someone. So trait combinations are actually really unique in that they help us understand or help clinicians understand maybe the best way to build a therapeutic relationship with a client, maybe the best type of treatment approach. What sort of kind of flavor of difficulty is this person going to be experiencing who I'm about to meet? Severity, on the other hand, allows us to understand how much support or care someone might need. So someone who's more on the severe end of personality disorder likely needs higher intensity of treatment, maybe a few times a week, or maybe an inpatient admission if that's necessary. Whereas someone who's more on the mild end might be able to be managed through the community and has lower support needs. I think that this model also allows for change. So this model inherently acknowledges that severity can fluctuate as someone engages with treatment. And I think it's really nice to have severity as the target rather than saying you have to get rid of, your personality, which can feel really daunting. And finally, it's an evidence-based approach. So this approach has been formed using decades of personality theory, which has always stated that personality has these sort of 5 traits, and it's really supported in the literature. There are also some challenges with this model. So as I've mentioned, clinicians might not feel confident with a new system and this jump to just one personality disorder diagnosis. The hybrid model aims to assist with this transition, but some people find this hybrid model very confusing. There's also the difficulties with losing a label, which I'm going to touch on a little bit in the next slide. But if you've identified with BPD for so long and it gave you a lot of validation, it can feel really confronting to see this label removed. And it can be quite confusing to just think, okay, so they've just gotten rid of BPD. What does that mean for me? I'm going to speak a little bit about my perspective as someone with lived experience, as someone who identifies with the BPD label, but I now identify with the PD label. And obviously, I'm a little bit biased towards the dimensional model, and this is just my experience. And I just wanted to flag a lot of people with lived experience have different opinions to me. And that's the beauty of lived experience. So I think this model, I really love the flexibility. As I've mentioned, I think the severity gradient allows for recovery-oriented treatment, which is a really great thing. And I think that oftentimes receiving a label like BPD can feel like a life sentence. And I think that this new way of thinking about it with the severity fluctuations helps you feel a little bit more manageable. I think something really unique about this model is the integration. So I know from experience that there can be a little bit of within personality disorder stigma, which is, to be expected when the media demonizes people with personality disorder. So maybe people with antisocial personality disorder have negative attitudes towards some people with BPD and vice versa. I think that this model is great because it acknowledges that these 10 separate types of personality disorder really aren't that distinct from each other, and we have a lot more in common than we do differences. So I think it allows us to come together as people with PD and really fight the stigma together rather than having a separate BPD awareness week, NPD awareness week, and so on and so forth. On the co-occurrence point, I think it's much easier to receive just one diagnosis rather than figure out how you can have two or three. And then in identity, this is something I flagged a second ago. There are challenges letting go of the BPD label. And I think I was quite defensive when I first learned about the dimensional model because I thought that they were saying that BPD didn't exist. And I found it really confronting to read all of these academics arguing against BPD. And I was like, don't they understand this label has really helped me figure out, what was going on for me? As I kept reading, I realized that no one is actually arguing that people diagnosed with the categorical system no longer have a personality disorder. What we're arguing is that there's a better and more personalized way to describe the challenges someone is experiencing rather than these labels like BPD, which can mean so many different things and often create more problems than they solve. So once I accepted this system, I realized it actually would have been quite useful to hear about the specific difficulties that I experienced. And I think I would have preferred to receive a diagnosis in this way. What does this mean for carers? So we are moving towards a dimensional model for the next version of the DSM. There's no kind of indication that this is going to be in the next version of the DSM, but it's really the push that academics are making. They really want this to be in the next version of the diagnostic manual. If we do adopt this, there may no longer be a BPD, just PD. Support groups might change their name to PD rather than BPD, and you might notice some support groups start to talk about supporting people with personality disorder rather than supporting one of the 10 specific types, and resources will follow suit. Something important that will come from this is that reducing stigma will not just be with BPD, but will be with all personality disorders. What can you do? I think becoming educated on the dimensional model is really important. And I think if the person in your life is at a point where they are receptive to hearing about this and they're not in a kind of acute phase of distress, encouraging them to learn about the dimensional model could also be really useful for them and help ease this transition period to a single diagnosis. So I'll just tell a really quick story about what happened with autism in the DSM-5. So I don't know if many of you were aware, but we used to have condition autism, and it was split into kind of 4 different conditions. One of these was Asperger's. But as time went on, a similar problem to personality disorder happened where they realized that Asperger's and autism were not really that different and that it was more of a severity spectrum, and Asperger's might be at the lower severity range. They also found that clinicians couldn't really reliably tell or make a diagnosis of Asperger's versus autism. So in 2013, when the newest DSM came out, they just collapsed all of these categories into one autism spectrum that's specified by level of support needs. But a lot of people who had been previously diagnosed with Asperger's were really upset by this decision because they thought it meant that the manual was saying that Asperger's wasn't a real thing and what they went through wasn't real. And that's because that community awareness and community consultation wasn't as great as it could have been. I think we really run the risk of doing this for personality disorder if we're not careful, if we do move towards a dimensional model. So I think coming to sessions like this, reading up on the dimensional model and getting the person in your life to be aware of what this means is really important to make sure we don't have that kind of Asperger's effect. I think, as I said, we need to advocate for all personality disorders. So I think carers are some of the best advocates for reducing the stigma of personality disorder, both for the person, stigma against the person with a personality disorder, and then stigma against the carer. And I think if we're advocating for personality disorder in general, rather than just a single categorical personality disorder, we'll be able to make much more of an impact. So my take-home message is we aren't removing personality disorder from the diagnostic manual, and we're not arguing that BPD isn't a real challenge experienced by many people. This new model just allows us to develop a more personalized and evidence-based approach that has the flexibility for people to recover and is a bit less black and white. It is time for us to come together and support everyone with a personality disorder to make meaningful change to all of those experiencing distress as a relation to their personality functioning. I wanted to highlight that I've got some extra resources here. So I've got the ICD-11. These are all ICD-11, I've realized, because my research is focused on this. But if you do want to send me an email, I'm happy to send some DSM-5 alternative model. But hopefully you'll understand that they're actually quite similar to each other. So I think it's useful to read both. So the ICD-11 manual is free online. It is obviously written for clinicians, so some language might be hard to understand, but you can access it on the World Health Organization's website. These are two research articles that I found really useful when I was learning about the dimensional model. So the first one contains 3 case studies and kind of describes what that case study is going through in the new ICD-11 dimensional model language. And then the second one also includes some cases. They're a bit shorter. But it describes the ICD-11 model in greater depth. So I think those are 2 really good resources to start with. Obviously, again, they're written in academic language a little bit, but I think that they're relatively easy to understand. So thank you so much. I'd just like to acknowledge my supervisor, Martin Selbom, for teaching me so much about this dimensional model and letting me steal his analogy about the houses and the singers. I'm really keen to hear any questions that you might have, and also just any feedback that you might have. And if you want to send me an email, it's up on the screen. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really, really interesting. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of curiosity about how everyone's transitioning from one model to the next. So, yeah, really appreciate it. I was very interested to see. I didn't realize there was 256 combinations of the first one. So, yeah, it makes sense what you're saying. Um, I'll just check if we've got any questions from the audience. Otherwise, I think we've got a few questions that people sent through earlier. Um, would
Yes.
you like me to, have you got those in front of you, or would you like me to?
Yeah, I'm happy to run through a couple of those questions that we received earlier. So
Yeah.
I've just got them on my phone. So a couple of thank you
Okay.
everyone for
Uh,
sending in the questions. Oh, sorry, is
they
someone
can
just
send
asking?
the questions now. I can just listen. Okay. Or that's
Yeah. Feel free to speak up and ask a question if you have one that's burning.
Maybe just put your hand up first, and then I will. I'll
Yeah,
make
that
sure that we
sounds
don't
good.
talk over each other.
Perfect. So maybe I'll just start by answering a couple of the questions that were written in before. A couple of these I can't answer with confidence because it's maybe not my area of expertise and I'm still a student, I'm still learning. But there were a few questions about officially diagnosing teenagers. So can 16 or 17-year-olds be officially diagnosed with a personality disorder? And the answer is complex. So there used to be a hard and fast rule of you can't diagnose under 18-year-olds, but there's been a lot of research that shows that personality disorder can show up from as young as the age of 12. A lot of clinicians still are quite reluctant to make a diagnosis under 18, and they might instead describe like borderline traits instead of making that formal diagnosis, because they might have this idea that your personality doesn't fully form when you're under 18, and so you can't make a personality disorder diagnosis, even though the literature suggests that you can. So the answer is technically you can make a diagnosis under 18. I think for all of them except for antisocial personality disorder, you can, but a lot of clinicians don't actually do this in practice. Um, and then another question. So, does the ICD-11 supplement the DSM-5 or is it a different type? Hopefully my presentation made that a little bit clearer, but the main difference is they do kind of complement each other, but the DSM-5 was developed in America for use in America and is just used in Australia. It's just the one that we've always used, whereas the ICD was developed by the World Health Organization for more of an international context. There's also the question of, is it possible to recover? I think that obviously experiencing a personality disorder can be really challenging and can be really distressing. And I know from personal experience, but there is always the chance of recovery. And recovery is quite possible. There's a lot of really great interventions out there for personality disorder that are really, really effective. I think it's just like going through any other mental health condition. And if you put in the work, recovery is completely possible. And there's many people, and myself included, who've reached that point of recovery. Um, and then I think the rest of the questions were maybe similar to each other or ones that I'm not 100% I'm sure I can answer. So if there were any other questions in the chat or any other questions people want to put their hand up and ask, I'm happy to answer those ones.
Sorry, I just realized I was still on mute.
Yeah.
I was actually just looking on our YouTube channel to get the exact name. There is a question um, from Caroline about if there's any prevalence with ADHD or other sort of neurodiverse traits and BPD. And what I was going to say, I was just trying to find the title, but we did go to our YouTube channel because we actually had, I think it was Dr. Lucas Cheney speak exactly on this topic a few months back about just the contra, the sort of comorbidity of those two things. So if you want to have a look deeply, it was a fantastic and fascinating presentation. But yes, Rachel, you can answer this.
Yes. Well, I was just going to add that this is obviously my area of research, but I'm looking at it with this dimensional model. And if anyone's interested, what we found in our first study, which is very preliminary, but we found, indications that the dimensional model of personality disorder better captured the overlap with ADHD and autism, and that the BPD construct, there was overlap with ADHD and autistic traits. But because BPD is so varied, it wasn't kind of the best way to capture this overlap. So we found that when we used that personality disorder severity indicator, there was a lot of overlap between that and then autism and ADHD. And, there is a lot of evidence kind of for the more categorical models. But hopefully my publications will be coming out soon to add to that body of literature for the dimensional models. So yes, there is definitely lots of lines of thinking that suggest a higher prevalence with ADHD and autism.
Mm. Yeah, it's a very fascinating area, the whole thing.
Yes.
Um, I'm not going to ask Rachel about NDIS and personality disorder because I think that's probably a little bit out of your area
Yes,
of
that is out of my scope,
expertise.
unfortunately.
But we've got a question asking, is OCD the same as OCPD? So
Yes,
I'm
so
assuming,
they're actually different. Yeah, no, that's completely fine. It's not my super area of expertise, but I am aware of the distinction. So they're different in the way that we think about. I think the best explanation for it is OCD is maybe more. The names make it confusing. OCD is more related to those like compulsions and obsessions that can be really distressing for the individual to have, and they experience like they do not want to think that way and they do not want to have these obsessions and compulsions. And it can be incredibly distressing. They feel like they have to do certain rituals that they really don't want to do. I think the way that we think about OCPD is more about rigidity and more about having this set of standards and this set of rules that you feel like you need to follow. And at times, the person with OCPD might agree with these rules and might not think that these rules are as distressing as someone that be experiencing the same sort of thing with OCD. But I'm not super clear on the distinction myself, but I think that's the main way that we're taught that they're distinct. But there's definitely a lot of literature out there that clarifies the distinction.
yeah, perfect. Thank you. I think I was just seeing if anyone was knowledgeable, but the question around the NDIS, I think from memory, don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure BPD alone is generally a little bit more difficult to get under NDIS. I think usually it has to have a broader, it's not more, I think they don't look so much at the diagnosis, but more about the functional impairment and the wider limitations. But I am not an expert on NDIS, so we can certainly ask for you and post some commentary, or we can email you if you want to email us, we can find out for you. Um, has there been any commentary that this is just about a group of academics trying to streamline diagnostic tools as part of being seen to develop different diagnostic models?
Yes, I think this is a bit of a point of controversy as well. I think this comes a lot from academia can be quite an exclusive space and also quite a competitive space. But I think that from my own experience in this area as an academic or a PhD student at the very least, I think that there is just a lot of literature support for this model. And there's a lot of, when we take this model to clinicians in preliminary studies, they also have higher acceptability. So they think this is a better way to describe personality disorder as well. I think that we could definitely benefit from a lot more community consultation to make sure that these diagnostic models are actually helping the community and are actually more validating for the people experiencing personality disorder. And I think that will make sure that we're not just trying to, you know, make sure that we're the one who came up with the new diagnostic model. And we'll
Mhm.
make sure that our research is actually having an impact with the community. But unfortunately, the community is often left out of these sort of discussions. So hopefully today kind of starts the process a little bit more.
Thank you. Is there any benefit in being reassessed, maybe a few years down the track after initial diagnosis?
So I'm not sure how 100% I can comment on this one, but I think it's just if you're thinking about, if you think that the label wasn't a good fit for you, and if you think that you're experiencing a different set of difficulties, maybe when you originally got diagnosed, you were in a very specific time point in your life, and now you're at a completely different stage, and you think that you would benefit from being reassessed, it's definitely a conversation that you can have with someone like a GP or a primary referral psychologist. But I think that if you feel happy with the diagnostic label and you still think it's a good descriptor for you, and you're asking about if it's worth it to get reassessed given this dimensional model, it'll basically just be if you've been diagnosed with the categorical model, the dimensional model still kind of captures the difficulties that you were experiencing. So you don't need to go and get reassessed in order to access treatment. You'll still be able to access treatment even if you have that label. But that's a lot of ifs to get there. So that's if we implement the dimensional model and so on and so forth. So at the moment, it's fine.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so I don't think we've got too many more questions. Does anyone have any last burning questions? Otherwise, I think we'll take an early mark and let Rachel and say thank you to Rachel for your time. It's been so informative tonight and yeah, very educational for everyone. Um, oh, sorry, someone just put a question down. I'm just making sure. Uh, yes, no, I think yeah, we'll let access this. Yeah, no, that's fine. Oh, someone's asking about. I'll actually ask you this question, then we'll wrap up. Um, if your loved one, I guess, if your loved one doesn't want to take treatment, what do you do? How do you encourage them? Is that
I think that this is, yeah, I don't know if I can speak to this as someone who
a
wasn't a carer of someone with personality disorder. And I was
yeah,
also, in my experience, I was a young person.
yeah,
So my parents had a lot more kind of clinical, I guess, authority over me with these. So but I think it is a really tricky period to navigate. But I don't think it's something that I can speak to personally, as I just don't have experience in
yeah.
that sort of area.
Sorry, I shouldn't have put you on the spot there. I was trying to make
No,
sure
that's
on their
completely fine.
question.
No, I totally get it. And I do actually just see that there's one more question about what can we do to ensure that there's more community consultation in the future. I think that this is a really important point. I think that attending sessions like these is a really good first step. And I also think that we really need, and hopefully, maybe we can get your parents to present. I hopefully we will have more studies that come out where we invite kind of community attitude discussions, or we have what we call focus groups where we get people to kind of talk about their opinions on this new model. We do interviews with people who have lived experience, and then we can kind of formally document that and publish papers on it to spread it with the scientific community. So I think that's the kind of next step. We need to do more formal community consultation, but I also think informal community consultation like this is really useful. And it's really great just spreading the word, attending things like this, sending me an email if you have a question, and so on. So yeah, I really thank you guys all for your time.
Yeah, so thank you again. I'll say thank you so much from us at NEA. We really appreciate your time, and I'm sure that it was worth yeah, everyone attending tonight to get that important information. So thank you so much, and hopefully we'll have you back again another time next year.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. I really appreciate it. So yeah, have a great night. I'll stop the recording now.